Ali said that I should conduct it as a fireside chat. So, apologies, no fire. It's burning in our hearts. Okay. You know, whereas we have created an excellent ecosystem for research, what we have not done is to have research on macro fiscal issues, which are perhaps the most important issues this country is facing. Now, of course, long term we come at it because we look at incentives in the research that is being done. But it's short-term macro stabilization, macro fiscal issues, where our ecosystem still needs to be developed. But to compensate for that, we've got real heavyweights. You can't get a better collection of people than we have as our panelists today. They bring enormous amount of international experience, Pakistan experience, academic experience, policy experience. So it's very truly privileged in having this panel, and I'd like to congratulate Ali and Hadia and others who have made this happen. I feel somewhat reluctant to introduce these gentlemen to you and Dr. Aliya. They're all extremely well known. So let me just a couple of sentences perhaps on each. In order of in which they will speak, Mohsin Khan, one of our preeminent international macro-fiscal, not with no hyphens, economist. He led the research. He was director of the Research Institute at the IMF. He then was director of Central Operations, Middle East region, where Pakistan was. He led many missions to Pakistan, and he brought that rich international experience into the design of the Pakistan program. It'd be fantastic to hear his views. We have with us Dr. Hafeez Pasha. Nobody knows the Pakistan economy better than Dr. Hafeez Pasha, the ins and outs of it, the micros and macros of it. He's with us. He will tell us what goes wrong. Why don't we get off the stabilization treadmill? And he will tell us what the fiscal problems are that don't allow us to get off the solution of which we have not found, and therefore we can't get off the macro stabilization treadmill. We then have Dr. Aliya Khan, who brings enormous labor markets experience to the panel. You know, she's the heart of the economics department at Quaid Azam University, but she sits on all kinds of important policy committees. So she will also tell us from the labor market angle. She'll come to productivity issues, to technology, and why our exports are not competitive, which is the other reason why we can't get out of our macro stabilization treadmill. And finally, to keep our feet firmly planted on the ground, we have Dr. Murtaza Syed, Deputy Governor, currently Deputy Governor, former acting Governor of the State Bank of Pakistan. He brings enormous international experience from the IMF. He's one of our leading macro fiscal, macro dehyphenated economist, and he will tell us where things stand today on some of the big issues that agitate our minds, which is, are we about to go bankrupt? How bad is our debt? Is it sustainable? So, fantastic panel. Let me start off by first putting a couple of questions to Mohsin. Let me draw your attention to this graph. I'm sorry, the panelists. This, we've had 5 macro IMF programs since 2020. Since 2000, And I've just plotted 3 of those. The one in 2008, and the second one in 2013, and then the third one in 2019. And I just want to show you, I mean, this is the current account balance, which is the real issue that affects our macro stability. And as you can see, the current account large deficit, IMF program comes in, the current account deficit is brought down. Let me see. The current account deficit starts, oops. इसको चलाएंगे ज़रा? To go back to the first slide. वहाँ से कर दें. Okay, it's moving. Thanks. So, the IMF program is terminated. The current account deficit goes to a new low, which means we are in trouble. IMF program starts, the current account improves, IMF leaves, another low, IMF program comes, current account improves, and another low. So we can't seem to get off the treadmill over and over again. And the key variable that agitates everybody, which is inflation, that hits people the most during macroeconomic instability. And again, as you can see, IMF program and how inflation is tracked as the IMF program progresses. We have high inflation. When the program starts, inflation comes down, goes to another peak. Again, next program, inflation comes down, and then it begins to rise again. So given this, Mohsin, without getting into the specifics of the Pakistan program, what is the international experience in IMF program design? And how well have these programs done? What is the target of these programs, and how well have they done internationally?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ijaz, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. First of all, I must say that this is the first time I've heard myself being described as a macro-fiscal economist. I think Hafeez Pasha is the macro-fiscal economist, not me. But this is World Bank terminology. I'm essentially a macroeconomist. Okay, I actually think that, I mean, I can answer your question specifically about the international experience, but I think, you know, others are going to talk a lot more about Pakistan. Let me just briefly, if you allow me, just mention what is it, the concept that we're talking about in this panel. And the first, I mean, the title is great, Macroeconomic Stability and Economic Growth. Let's define our terms as well. What do we mean by macroeconomic stability? That will lead into what you were saying. What is it that we mean when we say we want macroeconomic stability? Macroeconomic stability is, in my view, to summarize and simplify, comprises of 3 things, essentially. And that is a current account, it can be a deficit, a current account deficit that's financeable by autonomous or sort of capital flows. Those autonomous can be borrowing, etc., but not emergency capital flows. It's low inflation, and I'll define what low inflation is in that way, an adequate level of foreign exchange reserves, that allow you to maintain a current account deficit if you wish. And for most developing countries, that's a good objective. So in the broadest terms, that's what macroeconomic stability is. And is not and cannot be an end in itself. And that's why I like the linkage between macroeconomic stability and growth. I will say straight up front, and I hope the panelists the rest of the other panelists will agree with me, macroeconomic stability is a necessary condition for economic growth. It is not a sufficient condition. So the converse of that, or the corollary of that is that macro instability is bad for growth. And so basically, what are the question that you ask is with the current account chart and the thing is trying to achieve macroeconomic stability involves certain costs to the economy. There are certain benefits. Of course, you get an improvement in the current account, which is what you want. You get a reduction in inflation, is what you want. This is now international experience. Unfortunately, you can also get a fall in growth, which is not what you want initially, but it's a necessary outcome because inevitably, the policies that you undertake to achieve macroeconomic stability involve what is in Pakistan and in everywhere else called austerity policies. You have been living beyond your means. You now have to readjust your spending according to your means. When you do that, and Hafeez and I'm sure Murtaza and Dr. Aliya will talk about this in the context of Pakistan, the general evidence on international, now I'll come to international, and I will say it in the following way. Large-scale studies that have looked at the effects of IMF programs, some of which studies which I have undertaken myself, look at what happens to countries when the IMF comes in. And here is the sort of is empirical evidence on, close to 100 programs that we looked at, that you get an improvement in the current account, uniformly an improvement in the current account. You get an increase in your international reserves because you're getting an improvement in the current account. I mean, that's by definition. You get a reduction in inflation, and significant, and these are all statistically significant because this is an empirical econometric study. The studies, I should hasten to add. But the cost is that you do get a reduction in growth in a large number of cases. That is, you can call it temporary reduction in growth, but you do get a reduction in growth. Now, what does that mean for the relationship? The whole idea is that in the short run, you have to put your, in quotes, your so-called house in order. So you get your current account in order, you get your foreign reserves, adequate foreign reserves, you get a reduction in inflation, you get a reduction you get somewhat of a reduction in growth, with the view that over the longer run, this will lead to an improvement in the growth rate as well. And the growth rate issue is something that we can discuss later because it has very little to do with, I mean, macro stability, as I said, is not a sufficient condition. Macro stability will not generate growth for you. That's not it. There are other things you have to do, and as the other panelists will agree. So, to come back, and I can come back on any issue you wish and to talk about it, but I will just highlight one thing, and which has struck me. I've come to Pakistan in this year several times, and what has struck me is this incredible fascination that the country has, and people, and economists, by the way, have with the current account, the level of foreign exchange reserves, the rupee-dollar rate, which is a big thing that's talked about. And I think that's fine. It's all well and good to be concerned about this. But it's a concern, really, and I'd throw out something controversial, which is just by observation, which is primarily of concern to economists and, how should I put, as the newspapers put it, to the elites. This is not a major concern to the vast population of Pakistan. They couldn't care less what is the rupee-dollar rate, whether it's 200 or 230 or 220. The basic problem that Pakistan faces today is inflation. Inflation is what needs to be addressed. And so I'll just throw that out, and then if you like, I'll come back and talk to you about what you can do to get a handle on inflation. So my focus, I normally talk about macroeconomic stability, covering all these various variables and policies to achieve it. I think that to be of relevance to Pakistan now, the policies, and this is my advice to Murtaza Syed in particular, who is a colleague of mine in the IMF, is get a handle on inflation. Then we could talk about the other things that you need to be worrying about.
Okay, so Mohsin, just picking up on that, but first let me. This what Mohsin was saying, that macro stability is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. We can see that in this period when we've had very deep engagement with the IMF in response to our macroeconomic instability, this is growth rate in Pakistan. Till about late 1990s, the growth rate in Pakistan was consistently above India. Pakistan for 3 decades, maybe even 4, enjoyed a growth rate of 6% per annum. India was about 3%, and our Indian friends used to say, this is the Hindu growth rate, we can't seem to improve upon it. In the late 1990s, that's the last time India had an IMF program, India's growth rate trajectory changed, and since then, Indian growth has been consistently higher than Pakistan's, and with a lower growth rate in population, you can see that Pakistan's population growth rate is higher than India and Bangladesh, almost twice as high. The result is that GDP per capita, green is Pakistan, orange is India, GDP per capita, we were a third higher than India, and since 2000, we are now a third lower than India, and if I project this, it looks even worse. Now, so that's just to illustrate what Mohsin was saying, that it's a necessary condition but not sufficient. But Mohsin, on inflation targeting, you mentioned a number of criteria on which you can assess the IMF program in 100 countries or so. How did the program do on inflation?
Oh, on inflation, uniformly, you could bring inflation down, uniformly, across the board. But I think that the amount of, let me put it on a time scale. You can turn around the current account very fast, okay? And that's due to two things. Typically, we come now to the policies you use. It's tighter monetary and fiscal policies, which is to achieve. What are the policies to achieve macro stability? Well, basically, tighter monetary and fiscal policies, exchange rate flexibility. If you like, in the earlier days, a devaluation of the exchange rate. These are to make imports more expensive and give a boost to exports. So these can start impacting very quickly into the system. The current account turns around very, very quickly. You can increase your foreign exchange reserves. Money starts flowing in addition to your improvement in the current account, so your foreign exchange reserves grow up. Inflation is then the second thing which starts to slow down, and you can bring inflation down. So the sequence would be that it takes, if I was to make a rough guess, within a year you can bring in the current account, you can turn the current account around. Within a year or two, you can really have a serious dent on inflation. On growth is a completely different question, and that's what I think the panel will probably go into it. I mean, if I just mention two things. To me, the growth rate in any country, and that's the India case you mentioned as now, and to some extent the Bangladesh case, but largely the India case, what is the primary driver of economic growth and the primary drivers of economic growth are improvements in human capital and increases in physical capital. Now, so all the things that you think are necessary to improve those are what will improve your growth rate in the end. So when I say improvements in human capital and physical capital, human capital, there's lots of things to do, and I think the education issue, but it's a long run thing. The India example, I'll just throw it out. IITs were the key to improving human capital in the countries, which of course then led to a substantial increase in physical investment in the software industries, and therefore in exports. So while we were sitting back in Pakistan and saying, oh, well, this is the Hindu growth rate is going on. Meantime, in that process, India was then producing thousands and thousands of qualified engineers out of their IITs, and then you suddenly saw that the thing improved, and it's a sustained increase in the growth rate. So I think that if we can for home in, if we want to get really long-run growth, high long-run growth that can support, I mean, I'll throw out a figure for you. In Pakistan, you need roughly 6 to 7% growth rate in this country simply to absorb the new entrants into the labor force. That's your population problem. So that's, that really is the key to it. And I think investment in physical investment is driven by so many economic and non-economic variables that we can only focus on the economic variables. I think that the work that's being done, this is just an aside, the work that's being done on education in the country, which was mentioned by Mr. Shah Hussain as well, the work that's being done now, that will, in the long run, inshallah, show up as an improvement in human capital. Physical investment that's going on is driven by a lot of things as well. Here I would point out, and this is a current day observation, you all probably know better than I do, but the current day observation is the investor that's investing in a country was going to look at a number of variables, domestic investors, not necessarily foreign investors, domestic investors, look at a number of variables and, cost of credit, markets, and regulations, labor regulations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I'll tell you, in my own judgment, the biggest effect, the largest effect on private investment in a negative fashion is political uncertainty. If there's our uncertainty in general, which can be generated by political issues, of course, as well. And when investors are uncertain about the future, they don't invest. If they don't invest, you can have macro stability to infinity, and that won't help.
So we'll come back to Mohsin with some of these questions. But you know, as several Indian economists say that what those early investments, when India was experiencing the so-called Hindu growth rate, what those early investments were doing was to help change India's image in the world. IT, they say, made every Indian look techie rather than an Indian with a beggar's bowl. And that change of image made a huge difference to what happened in India subsequently in terms of investments and growth. Let me just preface my conversation with Dr. Pasha with a couple of graphs. This is public investment in Pakistan compared with India and Bangladesh. And again, the green line, which you don't see very clearly because of the lights, the green line is Pakistan, and you can see it is the lowest compared to both India and Pakistan, substantially lower. And not just, but what is not low is the share of consumption in GDP. Pakistan consumes 95% of its GDP. It's 70%, 72% in India and Bangladesh. And that, of course, translates into it doesn't translate into the end of the world, but it translates into private investment. The share of private investment in Pakistan is the lowest of the three countries. So I just want to preface this and come to Hafeez. How much of Hafeez is due to our inherent macroeconomic instability, the cause of which is, as Mohsin says, political instability, and how much is it because of the IMF program, as many people say, and then what role has the government, what role has the fiscal deficit to play in all of this?
Thank you. I have been granted permission by the moderator to speak frankly.
Absolutely.
So that is what I plan to do. And let me start by just giving you quickly an insight into the degree of the fiscal imbalance this country faces today. The year which just came to an end last year, 2021-22, witnessed the largest deficit in the history of your country, almost 8% of the GDP. And there have been years in the past when we were operating 4-5%, but 8%, and the target was 6.1, we went up to 8, 7.9 to be precise. And the problem has been that our tax to GDP ratio has been consistently on the decline. It was 11% about 6 years ago of the GDP, and last year it was down to barely 10%. And perhaps the most dramatic finding, which has just been highlighted by our moderator, Ijaz, is the level of public investment. Pakistan, there were years, particularly over 2 decades ago or so, when Pakistan's public investment used to be 5, 6, 7% of the GDP alone. On top of that, you had about 11% or so of private investment. But now, the total development spending by the federal and the provincial governments combined is down to barely 2.5% of the GDP. And what is totally devastating for us, the imbalances that have been created, for example, by the Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations and the NFC awards, the problem is your federal development spending is 1/4 of the total development spending. 3/4 is by the provinces last year. Very good. Provinces are investing in health and education. We welcome that. But with only 400 billion rupees of spending in the federal PSDP, what has happened? 1,029 ongoing projects. Wallah, we have a huge, wonderful portfolio full of sexy, beautiful projects. No implementation. All projects, including to me, the three crucial sectors: water resources, electricity generation, electricity distribution, and to some extent, if you like, the importance of highways, much less than others. Today, Pakistan, if it has a project with an engineering design period of 7 years, gets completed in 33 years. Let me now turn to some of the other fiscal problems. I took this up first because you highlighted them. Issue is, why is the tax to GDP ratio of Pakistan so low and declining? You know, India's corresponding tax to GDP ratio, whereas ours is down to 10, India is at 17. Fortunately for us, Bangladesh is slightly lower, but then Bangladesh gets off better because it has a much, much lower liability of defense spending. And that's what keeps them financially solvent. Now, why is Pakistan's tax to GDP ratio so low? And I take the liberty of being in the citadel of LUMS to talk about elite capture. Do I have your permission? Okay. Let me start by giving you one small example. You know, according to the agricultural census of 2010, 1% of our farmers, the rural elite, the feudal class, own 22% of the farm area. One of the most unequal distributions, definitely in South Asia, but globally. 1% owns 22% of, and that too the better land, because it's proximate to the canal systems and so on. Their annual income of the top 20% of the Pakistan's farmers is 980 billion rupees net of all costs, irrigation, tenants, electricity, everything else. 980 billion rupees is the net income of your top privileged quintile of farmers. What is your total agricultural income tax revenue out of 980 billion? 3 billion. 3 billion. What is this? And as he has allowed me, in Pakistan, we also have a very large establishment. And of course, our development, defense spending is close to 3% of the GDP. But do you know what is the sad state of sustainability of defense spending? In 2018-19, from the net revenues, you take out debt servicing and you find how much money you have left. Zero left. Entire defense spending financed through borrowing. Is it sustainable defense spending? And then Uncle IMF comes and says, reduce primary deficit, reduce primary deficit, reduce primary deficit. The biggest item to be reduced is defense. So today, with all due respect to the generals, defense spending has become unsustainable. Third, elite capture of, if you like, some of the other elements in the urban side of the tax system. Good work done on this particular tax by Ali Chima and others. We have an urban immovable property tax, which is a responsibility of the provincial governments, and it is supposed to be the prime mechanism for funding the provision of basic services linked to the housing. The top quintile of the cities of Pakistan, their owner-occupied imputed income plus actual rental income is 650 billion rupees annually. And the tax rate on this particular group, the top quintile, on paper, according to the law, is 20 to 22%. What is our revenue from the 650 billion of rental incomes? 23 billion rupees, which is hardly 3 to 4%. अब इस निज़ाम में क्या हो सकता है, आप मुझे बताइए। हम लड़ के थक गए जब भी हम गलती से हुकूमत में थे। मुझे याद है मोइन अफजल, my wonderful colleague, who was my colleague finance secretary. You remember the agricultural income tax and how we managed to push it through? He got it through, but there was no revenue. The point simply is, a formal PhD by one of my students recently on the incidence of taxes in Pakistan. Who bears the tax burden? Answer, yes. The ratio between the burden of the top quintile and the bottom quintile is about 4.5 to 1. So the rich pay 4.5 times what the poor man in the lowest quintile pays. The ratio of the incomes is 5.5 to 1. So the overall tax incidence is regressive. I've given you an insight into the structural problems and my own acceptance of inability to tackle this overwhelming domination of the elite, which you saw. I'll just give one last example and then I'll stop. 2 million or more retail outlets. And somehow or the other, if you remember, Moeen, we tried to introduce through electricity bills a presumptive tax regime so that it was simple and it was linked to the electricity bills and so on. That was kind of demolished by this very politically strong and volatile and powerful group. And today, recently, the government tried to introduce a 3,000 rupee levy on shops, and it got shut down. End of story. Elite or power pressure groups who have very little sense of what is the larger interest of your beloved country. Thank you.
Since you said that the moderator has allowed you to speak frankly, please allow the moderator to ask you a few more questions.
Please.
Also. Okay. So just to highlight what Hafeez has said about the tax culture, surveys show that there should be 7 million income tax paying individuals in Pakistan. Less than 2 million actually pay tax.
Yes.
So keep that statistic in mind, and that's partly the agriculture income. And Anjum Naseem is sitting here in the audience.
Yes, he's there.
Anjum has done very comprehensive study of the agriculture income tax. And while he's absolutely right, just capturing agricultural income for purposes of taxes will allow you to generate more revenue. But the real problem with agriculture not paying an income tax, a regular income tax, as opposed to this provincial tax that they pay, is that you can hide other money as farm income. You are exempt from other income is exempt from taxation because it shows up. FBR has tried to reconcile information on agricultural income versus other income, but it's not been easy. So there's, just to highlight that. What I wanted to turn to also, Hafeez, was your recent work on subsidies.
Okay, wonderful.
So it's elite capture, the one aspect of elite capture is not paying taxes. The other aspect of elite capture is enjoying huge subsidies.
Absolutely.
So
thank you. Another fascinating new historical fact, a new trend has emerged. Voila. The state-owned enterprises of Pakistan today eat more of your budget, federal budget, than does the defense establishment. Can you imagine this? Last year, our subsidy bill went up 3 times in 1 year to 1,500 odd billion rupees. 1,200 of this was just that black hole called the power sector of Pakistan. And that is not the end of the story. These state-owned enterprises have access to what is known in a very innocent terminology as guaranteed debt. And today, the contingent liabilities which every year the federal government has to pay for, these are subsidies in the form of access to guaranteed debt, is another 400 billion rupees. You add up the two, 1,900 billion rupees, okay, ignore the 300, 1,600 billion rupees, and formally the budget of the defense establishment is 1,415 billion. I'm not necessarily arguing in terms of an increase in defense spending, but I'm certainly arguing in terms of bringing this huge mammoth subsidy. It's killing us. And why has this happened? Because of a policy of inaction, corruption, and inefficiency. Today, the losses in the power sector have exponentially grown. Do you know that combined, if you include the 3 stages of losses, something like 26 to 28% of the power does not reach the final consumer? And then our hesitation politically to announce occasional quarterly increases in tariffs, so on and so forth. All these inefficiencies have mounted, and today this monolithic power sector is at the crux, at the heart of this fiscal and other macroeconomic dilemma of Pakistan. So this is where we stand unless we bring back the state-owned enterprises to, all of you talk about railway being subsidized. Yes, 50 billion. PI being subsidized, 40 billion. But the power sector, 1,200 billion, God save us. I'll stop here.
I just want to complete Hafeez's description of the misuse of subsidies. Not only is the subsidies huge, but South Asia in general is the only part of the world where residential price for energy is lower than for industry. And Pakistan is no exception. So the problem with the residential subsidy is the more, and the way it's structured, the more energy you consume, the more air conditioners you have in the house, the larger the subsidy you get. Yeah. So it's a very clear elite capture example. The other thing, of course, is a subsidy that's given to manufacturing. and that is also very poorly targeted. It's not, if I were to design the subsidies, I would reserve the subsidies for exporters, because as Dr. Aliya will tell us next, that's where, so the repeated current account deficit problem, there are two major deficits underlying that. One is the fiscal deficit, and we've heard from Hafeez extensively on it. The other is the trade deficit, and we'll have Dr. Aliya speak about it. But despite the fact that the subsidies are such a large part of the problem, and researchers have tried to engage on this issue, because there is good data. That's one thing that's happened as a result of a lot of multilateral assistance in the energy sector, is that they collect very good data, but they will not share data with researchers. Because if you share the data, you can actually point out very clearly who is benefiting from the subsidy and how you can restructure the subsidy so you achieve your objective of supporting the poor households. So you give very targeted residential subsidy, and at the same time, within industry, you can assess which sector of the industry actually exports and therefore deserves the subsidy. But they will not share the data with researchers. So that's something research community has to keep in mind.
Make one point?
Sure, absolutely.
One final observation. Uncle IMF's program, do you mind if I address IMF as uncle?
Address it any way you wish.
Because we see them, we are children, they are uncles. Now look at the fiscal reform strategy that we have agreed with Uncle IMF. In the present program for the 9th, 10th, and 11th reviews. The entire emphasis on the fiscal side, believe it or not, entire emphasis for the future tax reforms to become in the next 3 reviews, including one which has just concluded, is on indirect taxes. Why is the IMF pandering to the elite and subjecting, what are those indirect taxes they're asking for? Perhaps the most dramatic example is the heavy taxation of petroleum products. We have been asked to levy a petroleum levy of 50 rupees per litre on motor spirit and high-speed diesel oil. 50 rupees. And that's almost, if you like, 40% or more of the import price. Second, they want us to, in the event there is a shortfall, which is always the case with FBR revenues, you will further enhance the liability on petroleum products of tax by reintroducing back the sales tax at 17%. You'll kill the common man, because high-speed diesel oil is the basic transport input which goes into agricultural commodities, basic essential item transport, and so on. Then what else do they want? They want us to, one good thing I like, although I'm myself guilty of that, is a heavy excise duty on cigarettes. But you know what has happened? Our skillful tobacco producers, in the first 3 months of this year, after the increase in excise duties, have reported a reduction in production of only 38%. Evasion galore. And finally, you won't like this. They want us to tax sugary drinks. So the IMF is suddenly becoming very health conscious, which is very good, very good. Thank you.
I will ask Mohsin and Murtaza to respond to this, but in a larger context of revenue increasing or reducing the deficit, as opposed to the specifics of which tax to levy. But we'll come to that in a minute. So IMF program comes and goes. The current account deficit continues to go up, go down, go up, go down.
I just conclude.
And Dr. Pasha has just told us what the fiscal side of the story is doing towards that instability. I'm going to.
One sentence.
Okay, please.
Just last sentence. I have humbly, as an academic for the last 30, 40 years, had the pretension of writing a book called Charter of the Economy. A copy will be made available. I will ensure this access to our moderator. It's available soft. It's been launched by the German foundation, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. In that, in about 10 pages, I have indicated a radical tax reform agenda which takes us out of elite capture and gives us an additional 2,500 billion rupees. If implemented, our fiscal problem is solved, but with all due respects, I do not see this happening if the elite continues to have no sense of enlightened self-interest. I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Hafeez. Dr. Aliya, so fiscal deficit is one part of the story of the current account. Deficit and therefore instability and not getting growth going. Mohsin articulated it very well. You've got to have investments, you've got to have productivity growth, you've got to innovate in terms of technology, etc., to get growth going. Of course, macro stability is important, but it's a necessary condition and not a sufficient condition. Please tell us what's going wrong on the trade deficit side, particularly what's going wrong with our export performance, because as you can see, our export performance, we were the highest exporters in terms of export to GDP ratio up to the late 90s in South Asia. Now, our export to GDP ratio is the lowest, below India, below Bangladesh. Over to you, Dr. Aliya.
Thank you, Ijaz. And there are a lot of young researchers in the room. So when I got an invite to talk on this topic of macro stability and economic growth, I thought very hard as how to position my comments. And then I remembered something that my late Professor Dr. Ali Arsalan at Quaid Azam University told me, that whenever you are preparing for a talk, always try to search of which dimension you can add value to, and that'll force you to think of avenues which probably are not that visible, but that enlightenment will not only help you, but other people in the room also. So I tried to do that, and let me first comment on this nexus between macro stability, or I'll take it on the flip side. What does macro volatility do to a country like Pakistan? And this is in the context of international evidence. Whatever I'm going to say is backed by international evidence, whether it is published literature in journals or the latest available reports issued by international organizations. And I think one of the knowledge deficits is that we do not capitalize on the knowledge that is being so widely disseminated through the digital means, and learn lessons to inform our research ideas in a more aligned manner, maybe. So macro volatility obviously impacts the growth process. But what it also does is that it impacts inequality and inclusiveness. And since you talked of Dr. Mehboob Haq, I think it is the right place to say that we have to look at this linkage, which is now being debated at a very, very macro level. I mean, inequality and macroeconomics were never taken together, and now they are. For the information of the audience, the latest World Inequality Report, which is published by the World Inequality Database, that has an interesting nugget of information that nations have become wealthier, but governments have become poorer. So there is concentration of wealth in the private sector, but the governments are poor. So when the governments are poor, state capacities to deliver on essential services that build the human capital stock of countries, especially countries as large and populous as Pakistan with a huge youth population, they suffer. So I don't think we should be surprised at the macro outcomes that we are seeing, because unless we tease out what is leading to these the macroeconomic indicators, we will be just scratching a surface, and the answer will be deep down. And when you talk of trade deficit, when has Pakistan really, in true spirit, followed an export-oriented growth policy? I mean, we kept talking about export-led growth, but did we prepare our workforce? And I'm going to really stick to human capital because, yes, we did try to address the cost of doing business, and we talked of ad nauseum about export diversification, which is written down in every trade policy and trade framework document, but was never really followed. And why? Because we never prepared for the kind of export orientation that other countries in South Asia, and since you chose to compare Pakistan with Bangladesh, I'm going to do the same. I will not focus on India that much because I think it's probably more distressing for us to compare ourselves with Bangladesh, because I grew up in a Pakistan which saw the split of Pakistan, and I remember the kind of discourse of inequality and inequity that led to that split. And we are still very shy of really learning lessons from that split. But what happened was that when Pakistan started talking about export-led growth, it did not address the whole framework that gives a country the leadership position in exporting manufacturing products to begin with, because Bangladesh did not automatically step into service exports. It made its route through the textile exports. But the difference was we did not pay attention to our human capital stock that was engaged in the export-led industries. And also, we did not pay attention to the MSME sector, which is the medium, small, and micro enterprise sector, which, as all of you know, who worked on manufacturing, is the engine of growth for export, for the export sector in not only in South Asia, Southeast Asia, but even in Europe also. I mean, the clusters that led to such impressive exports are in the MSME sector in developed countries as well. We did not pay attention to gathering data on the MSME sector. The last economic census was conducted 3 decades ago almost, so we have really no idea of what the profile of the MSME sector is, and much less do we have an idea about the workers engaged in the MSME sector who are supposed to contribute to production of exports through which Pakistan would be able to earn the foreign exchange that we should earn to have a trade balance. So we are a consumption-led economy, and that too, because of the vast growth of the informal economy, the consumption patterns have now become much more equitable, I can say that, than we would expect, because being the chair of the National Poverty Estimation Committee, we were also given the mandate to compute inequality figures. Maybe that is one of the reasons why the report is still not out, but we get estimates for Gini coefficients that are very satisfactory for Pakistan, looking at the other macro indicators, because the consumption inequalities have smoothened to quite an extent. And I think an import restriction strategy is really not going to work the wonders that we think it would probably do, because, I mean, there's something like the ratchet effect that, you know, and the Duesenberry effect, that people get used to a certain level of and the profile of consumption. Anyway, coming back to human capital, I'm just going to share two very stark statistics, which I'm sure many people are aware of. The latest human development report published by the UNDP, it's called Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives. So we are not talking of a Pakistan-specific problem, but we have to contextualize Pakistan in that unsettled world and uncertain times. The mean years of schooling for a person of age 25 and above, in terms of educational attainment, for females, it is a mere 3.9 years in Pakistan, and for males, it is 5 years. For Bangladesh, for females, it is 7 years, and for males, it is 8. So the gap between the male and female is not that wide, but see the level. And that is the incremental level of human capital advancement that makes the difference. Then another thing that we have really not spoken about, but we should, is the female labor force participation rate. Bangladesh story of success is mainly because they brought the women out into the labor force in numbers which were historic, keeping in view their traditions. I mean, you know, now there's a lot of work going on gender norms, and we really should intersect that work with our macro frameworks, as Shandana also mentioned in the morning, that this conference, Seeking Pathways to Development, should really try to explore all the intersectionalities that are possible, you know, for guidance of future research in this area. There is no single pathway to development. It's very complex. The female labor force participation rate in Pakistan never touched 25%, but what is of concern is, and it's happening in India also, and they're very concerned about it, but there is a lot more discourse in India. We are concerned, but we are not talking about it. It has dropped from 22 to 20% in Pakistan. In Bangladesh, it is 35%. Even that is not very high compared to East Asian countries where it crosses 50%, but at least they are on the trajectory, they are on the way. They have managed the fertility transition. Dr. Atiya Inayatullah is sitting here. There's a whole session attributed to population issues tomorrow, I think, Dr. Atiya. But why should we take population out of the discourse of macroeconomics unless we have population weighing down our macroeconomic indicators? We cannot expect our trade deficit to become better. And very quickly, I'm also going to point out to some issues about global value chains, because the latest report on global value chains, and it's an excellent report by the Asian Development Bank Institute, really goes into how global value chains have shifted away from being manufacturing global value chains to being service-oriented global value chains. You gave, Dr. Pasha also gave the example of the growth, phenomenal growth of the IT industry in India. That is what they did. They linked up with the service global value chains through training their workforce in information technology. What did we do? Yes, we introduced metric IT and FSC IT, bachelors in IT, but we did not sort of link that IT sector human capital formation to our export sectors. So these are the growths, the gaps, and I'll come back to it.
Thank you very much. I think Dr. Aliya has very convincingly and comprehensively pointed out the fact that we are not skilling up the labor force, which will be needed to sustain productivity growth and therefore international competitiveness and therefore address the trade deficit part of the current account deficit. I'm going to, thing is, there's been a lot of researchers have been engaged in this area. You know, IGC has a firm's capability, thematic area. So a number of research studies have been conducted to identify the problems and what interventions can solve some of those problems. I want to turn to the fact that we have, despite the fact that we are not, broadly speaking, internationally competitive in most things, and wherever we were, it's coming down, we still have islands of excellence. The World Cup that just concluded in Doha was played with Pakistani soccer balls, and they were competing with the best in the world. I remember a time when Thai and Chinese soccer balls had developed the technology, which were not hand-stitched, machine-stitched, and the aerodynamics of the Thai and Chinese soccer balls was just as good. They were much cheaper than what Sialkot was producing with hand-stitched soccer balls. So Sialkot was losing that. But Sialkot industry invested in technology. They now have aerodynamic soccer balls which are hand-stitched, and therefore they've captured the market again. So we have exceptional islands of excellence. We also have, within the broad range of textiles, we have ready-made garments exporters. They export almost $4 billion worth of ready-made garments. And within that, we have extremely successful firms. The question is, why isn't that getting replicated? And Hafeez, just as we think Mohsin and Murtaza should be responsible for what the IMF does, I would turn to you and say, why hasn't the government succeeded in replicating the successes of these islands, identifying industrial clusters which could be supported, so that despite the problems of human capital, etc., we can increase the size of these islands of excellence?
Let me just first, Dr. Mohsin, I'd like you to address this question, which is linked to what Dr. Aliya has said. You see, Pakistan, particularly since the 90s, decided to switch from essentially a fundamental strategy of import substitution towards export promotion. And we followed the classic dictation of policy change, particularly given to us by IMF at that time, that bring down dramatically your import duties. And you will make import substitution less attractive to the local entrepreneur, who inevitably, therefore, will be forced to move on to some kind of export promotion manufacturing activity. This was a beautiful concept, and yours truly is partly responsible when he was Minister of Commerce for having halved the import duties. We brought the import duties in the early 90s with a maximum of 120%. Today, the maximum is 20. And the amazing statistic, Dr. Saab, the average MFN tariff of Pakistan is 11%. The average MFN tariff of Bangladesh is 14%. And what is even more striking is that the average MFN tariff of India is 18%, according to WTO statistics. We have opened all our doors. And we thought that, okay, there might be more imports, but there'll be a resource reallocation, exports will go up. We've seen the worst outcome, import growth, no export growth, despite this policy of moving away from import substitution to export promotion. Why has this happened? Answer, very quickly. Have you all studied the extremely ingenious export cash incentive of Bangladesh? Bangladesh, on top of the exchange, the translation from dollar to taka under the official exchange rate regime, very skillfully has designed a cash incentive scheme for exports, which, by the way, in some way replicates the brilliant export bonus voucher scheme of the Aliya Khan government. We had top-class civil servants at that time, including Moin Afzal and others. Pakistan was able to operate a kind of a dual exchange rate regime, and our bonus voucher scheme was even more ingenious. It was not only there to promote exports, but because of the market of trading in bonus vouchers, it was there to restrict imports. It was a dual instrument, a brilliant instrument, given up by Pakistan later. India gives 2% to 20% extra export income to particular 24 products. And there are 3 criteria for determining who gets more. Number 1, more value added, more incentive. Number 2, if you are an emerging exporter, more incentive. If you are going into a non-traditional market, more incentive. Voila. And I take pride in the fact that as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, I was helpful in designing that scheme. Thank you very much. We should do the same export incentives of the kind Bangladesh, and India has offered also a duty script scheme, which we need to study.
Thank you. So we looked at macroeconomic stability, and we've looked at the 2 principal reasons for that macro instability. Let me turn to Murtaza. Murtaza, how bad are things? Are we heading back to another? I won't say another macroeconomic crisis, but are we going to another low?
Thank you, Ijaz, for the very simple question. It's a deeply profound one, of course, but first of all, let me just thank you, Ali Chima, for the kind of invitation, him and also for helping arrange this. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel and to see a lot of, old friends in the audience as well. Manaza from Oxford, Akbar Zaidi, Dr. Aliya from IBA, Maruf, and of course, stalwarts like Moin Afzal and Atiyah Inayatullah. You didn't give me the privilege of speaking frankly. And I guess it was because you were looking out for me because I'm still a serving official.
I thought I was protecting you.
But let me try to seize that exorbitant privilege from you because I'm nearing the end of my term. And there is nothing quite as liberating as the nearing of the end of your term. Just ask Miftah Ismail, who's writing so beautifully now in the newspapers, and who I'm looking forward to hearing later today as well. Let me just begin by telling you a little bit of a personal story, which is that I had come back to Pakistan 3 years ago after working at the IMF, and I don't know why Hafeez Pasha Sahab is constantly referring to me and Mohsin to try to defend the IMF. We don't want to do that. I think we moved on.
You're the uncle.
We are the, I think we are Pakistanis is what we are, and that's what we're trying to do. And so I came back trying to help the country and thinking that I'd had this long experience, 17 years at the IMF, and things are going to be good. There's a reformist government here. And I was thinking on the plane from Karachi that things have actually come full circle, unfortunately. I came when Pakistan was just in the 2018-19 crisis. We had Corona, and now we're back with the IMF. And I was speaking to Dr. Pasha earlier and saying, well, you've seen this so many times before, and he was like, this time feels very different. So unfortunately, my term has been bookended by crises. There were good moments in the middle, though. I think in Corona in particular, we did fantastically, and I think it's recognized globally that Pakistan did quite well. I mean, it wasn't something that we can take personal credit for, but I think overall the country did very, very well. Now, at the same time, there is now this despondency again. Here we go again, the 23rd IMF program. People think this one is deeper and more serious than any one that we've had before. And so it's easy to get despondent. But it's at times like these that I remember Mehboob ul-Haq, actually, who you had talked about in the beginning. And Mehboob, was a very optimistic person. He was a big fan of Faiz as well, and I think one of his favorite couplets from Faiz was Nahi nigah mein manzil to jastaju hi sahi, nahi visal muyassar to arzu hi sahi. And I think that's an amazing thing. The other thing that gives me hope is actually the young people, and it's good to see young people here. You should not be despondent. And in fact, I will say something. We keep talking about elite capture. We should remember that you here are part of the elite. It's not easy to get into a university like LUMS, and you should feel empowered. I think with your education here, you can actually help things improve in Pakistan. So you may say that's all very good. What has that got to do with where we are today? I had a set of slides, but I think, just in the interest of time, and because you probably won't be able to see them anyway,
Questions from the audience.
absolutely. So they'll probably be much more eloquent than I can be, but I will share them with Ijaz Sahab, and you can kind of. So where are we right now? We are definitely in a difficult position. Why did we get here, I think, is also important to remember. Part of why we are in trouble is because of global factors. This is really the most complex policy environment that I think countries have faced in maybe 50 years. As we're coming out of Corona, you have global commodity prices that are shooting up. You have the Fed tightening like there's no tomorrow. You have inflation globally that's very, very high. Supply side and demand side factors both playing a role. And you have geopolitical tensions. You have the Ukraine war. You also have China and the US now facing off in a much more sort of stark way. That's putting pressure on countries like Pakistan that are commodity importers and that are viewed to have debt levels that are relatively high. As a result of which we are now getting talked about with a bunch of countries that Pakistan has never been compared with before. We're talking about Angola, you're talking about Chad, you're talking about Mozambique, Senegal, Zambia. This is not a good group of countries to be lumped together with. So partly it's a global thing. And you can see that even advanced economies are not immune from these pressures. Look at what happened to the UK recently when they tried to have irresponsible fiscal policy. The markets beat them back. So this is a time for responsibility because of global factors. The other thing, of course, the tragedy is that our troubles are also man-made. There are some homegrown reasons why we are facing pressures today. And that has to do with political polarization, which is making it hard to take the right policy steps, policy slippages as well. And I think also a little bit of over-exuberance when we saw that we were coming out of COVID quite well. Unfortunately, last year, we decided to have a long hiatus with the IMF. And we did a very pro-cyclical fiscal policy. We had an expansionary fiscal policy after 2 years of very, very prudent fiscal policy. That created a long gap with the IMF. And also we got complacent because our foreign exchange reserves last August rose to their highest level ever, $20 billion. We thought we could kind of forget about the IMF. I think what we didn't realize was that our growth model is actually inherently creating crises. You cannot grow in Pakistan with our current growth model without getting into trouble, because it gives rise to a current account deficit, fiscal deficit, usually is what sustains it. And lo and behold, within a year, we were back with the IMF. At that time, our foreign exchange reserves were $17 billion. This I'm talking about February this year. Then comes the political polarization in Pakistan, the change in government. And again, we have a long hiatus with the IMF. And it was irresponsible to do that because we knew we had external debt obligations coming up. So you have your foreign exchange reserves fall from 17 billion in February to about 10 billion by the time we're back with the IMF in September. I was acting governor, Miftah Saab, we negotiated a very hard review with the IMF. But we were back, and that would have been okay because our reserves at that time were about 10 or 11 billion dollars. Now you have another impasse because of the politics. So part of our problems are also man-made. Now, having said all of that and agreeing very much with what the panel is saying about the need to move our growth model away and doing hard structural reforms, why are things not as bad as you might think? Let me give you 5 factors. Let me give you 5 reasons why you should be cautiously optimistic and not believe in the doom and gloom. The first reason is that we are actually in an IMF program, and this is the IMF's job. If you're in an IMF program, they're the global lender of last resort. They make sure you have enough financing for your imports and your debt servicing. That is part of what they do. So as long as we are with the IMF, we should be okay. And this is not the case for Angola. It's not the case for Chad. It's not the case for Cote d'Ivoire, Mozambique, these countries. It wasn't the case for Sri Lanka. Left it till too late. The second reason why you should be cautiously optimistic is because policies are actually responding. Monetary policy has been tightened since last summer. Fairly early on, actually, if you compare this policy response to what we did in the last crisis we had in 2017-19, it took us 2 years to raise interest rates after the current account balance had started to burgeon beyond $500 million a month, which is typically the level which Pakistan starts to get into trouble with. So this time, we have moved much quicker, and we had actually got the current account deficit more or less in control now. The second thing that we have done differently is we've let the exchange rate go. And this is something that Mohsin was talking about. This is how you actually stabilize your economy. We have let the exchange rate depreciate this year by 20%, one of the largest depreciations in the world, a necessary action to take if you want to preserve your foreign exchange reserves. So we've done that very differently. Last time around, in 17-19, it again took us 2 years before we let the rupee move by even 1 paisa. And by then, we had run out of reserves. So the policy reaction is very different. That's point number 2. Number 3, it's actually working. The current account deficit has come down a lot this year. We are now, through the first 5 months of this fiscal year, running a current account deficit of just over $3 billion. Last year, we had a $17 billion deficit. And across import items, petroleum, iron and steel, plastic, food, volumes have come down dramatically this year. So it's actually working. The economy is slowing down. Classic stabilization, as Mohsin said. Unfortunately, growth also has to come down. It's coming down, but we can afford to bring it down because we had 2 years of very rapid growth before, 6%, one of the best performances globally. So that's point number 3, that actually we are, our policies are working. Point number 4 is that what gets people worried about Pakistan is our external financing needs. That really is the bottom line. If you can't meet your external financing needs, you're basically in a very, very bad situation. Let me give you some quick facts and figures. We need $31 billion this fiscal year. This is the current account deficit that we will have, about $10 billion, and then debt servicing, debt that's coming due this year, of $21 billion. So 31. Now, 13 is going to be an important number, and what I tell you, 13 is usually an unlucky number, but I understand that actually if you go back in time, even in France, it used to be a lucky number, in Egypt, in China. So 13, remember that number. Why is it important? Because so far this fiscal year, out of those $31 billion, we have already paid $13 billion. So we have done debt servicing of about $7 billion, and we have arranged rollovers of $4 billion. So overall, and we've, of course, funded the current account. So 13 out of those 31 is already done. We need an $18 billion more. Here's the other piece of good news. If you add together the commercial loans that Pakistan have, which are really G2G loans, these are loans that we owe to China, and they're really better thought of as official, and the official deposits that the state bank has with itself, again, you get 13 billion. Those are continually rolled over. There's no problem in rolling those over. So 13 that we've already funded, 13 that's kind of in the bag, together with additional commitments from friendly governments. So you've got $26 billion out of that 31 more or less secure. You need 5 more, and you've actually got overfinancing. If you look at what the IMF is going to give us, what that will catalyze in terms of multilateral lending, you need 5, which you need to worry about really. You have 12. So you have a cushion of $7 billion. You can afford to get it wrong a little bit on those 7 billion. So we are not in a dire situation. Our destiny is in our own hands. We have a narrow path. We have to stay with the IMF, but we have a path. So don't worry. The last point that I want to make is on our debt sustainability. People get very worried about Pakistan's debt. I'll just give you 2 or 3 figures that are important to keep in mind. First of all, Pakistan's debt to GDP ratio, IMF is projecting the public debt to GDP ratio will be about 70% of GDP this year. Not particularly high. If you look at what Ghana has, Mozambique has, it's 90, closer to 100% of GDP. So it's high, but it's not as bad as the countries that we're being lumped together with. The other thing that typically gets you into trouble is if you have a lot of external debt. Our external debt is about 30% of GDP. Again, not very high if you compare it to what other countries have. Another feature of your debt that gets you into trouble is if a lot of it, yes, I was coming to that. So a lot of what gets you into trouble is if the debt that is owed externally is by the private sector, if it's short term, and if you owe it to the private sector as well. On all 3 of those metrics, Pakistan is in a good place. Very little of our debt is owed by our private sector. Our public sector owes money to the world. Only 6% of our external debt is short term. That puts us in a good place. And 80% of our external debt is on concessional, sort of official, multilateral lending. We only have 20% of our debt that's on commercial terms. That again puts Pakistan in a good place. So I just wanted to give you those statistics to kind of calm you a little bit. It's not an easy situation, but it's not the end of the world.
Thank you very much. I really welcome an exposition, and I don't know why TV anchors don't talk to people like Murtaza, because my own understanding, and I've also had the opportunity to work on international crises myself, what distinguishes us from other countries which have long-standing problems with dealing with these issues is that the problem is not a private sector problem. It's not private sector debt. When private sector gets into a problem, your banks get into a problem. When banks get into problems, resolving bad debts in the banks becomes a big legal issue. It takes forever, as Southeast Asia experienced during the late 1990s. Our crisis is not like that. Our crisis is different, and for all the reasons that Murtaza has mentioned, we are not in any deeply unstable position. The problem is, as Mohsin said, growth. And growth comes from what Aliya said and what Hafeez said, which is, are we investing enough in our people? Are we incentivizing exporters? And are we, do we have an exchange rate policy which will continue to support exports? And we'll come to that in a minute. I need to open it up for questions. And I'm going to see lots of hands here. Let me start with you.
Hello. So thank you for such an informative session. What I wanted to ask...
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name is Fiza Malik. I'm an RA at SERP. I wanted to ask was, so you mentioned that one of the reasons that we should be cautiously optimistic is that as long as we're with the IMF, it's their job to bail us out, and we should not default as per the media outlets say. What I wanted to ask was, do you think that increasingly makes us dependent on IMF, and because our governments often have short-term plans and they don't really invest in like labor markets and other factors of growth? So do you think it increasingly makes us dependent on the IMF to forever keep bailing us out.
So I'm going to ask two other questions and then bunch them up. Please, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Javed Yunus, and I think today my biggest introduction is that I'm one of the former student of Dr. Pasha back in the years. Okay. So just one comment, Dr. Pasha, because you raised that point very aggressively about our power sector, which has become a monster on our debt or all the circular debt or all that. So I've been working on.
Quick question. I'm sorry. There's
Okay.
lots of hands up, and I have very little time.
So just let me give you one data point, which is this: that about the power sector. That
यार story ना सुनाए ना question पूछे, because I've got so many hands and these guys are going to throw me off the panel very quickly. So ask your question.
जो generation sector Pakistan का है, that is operating at, most plants are operating at 40%, 50%, 60% of the capacity. So what really makes me wonder is, why is really that? Are we paying them full capacity charges? And if we are paying them, what rate are we paying them? The capacity charges?
Thank
So
you.
this really is something.
The overhead cost issue.
So let me take one other question, then we can answer. Yes, Faisal, please.
So I want to take Murtaza Syed and Mohsin Syed back to inflation. I'm seeing even middle and upper middle class hurting quite a lot over the last year or so, and that's going to have intra-household expenditure reallocations away from long-term investment. So we have a lot of evidence on children being pulled out of schools and so on because of not just COVID and the floods, but also because this inflation is coming as a package and that's making it like. So how do you square that when you're being optimistic or even cautiously optimistic?
Okay, so so we have three questions. IMF dependence. Are you middle class being affected by inflation? And a very specific question about capacity utilization in power producers. So let me start with Mohsin, if you want to.
On this issue of IMF dependence, I think that Murtaza makes a point. I mean, whereas one can argue that if you don't have somebody backstopping you, in other words, you don't have a rich uncle, then basically you would behave differently. It's an argument that's made, and to some extent, Pakistan has been in IMF programs for a long time, not very successfully. I would say that usually the programs have not been completed. I would just like to say one other point, which it says Dr. Pasha sort of implied, but I'm not sure he actually said this thing. Dr. Pasha, you know, the issue of subsidies, the issue of where to tax, the issue of the where to cut expenditures, etc., does not come only from the IMF. The IMF puts forward an overall deficit target and says, look, you can only finance this deficit. You decide whether you want to do it through taxes or you want to cut expenditures, and whose expenditures you want to cut and whose subsidies you want to cut. So to say that, and I don't think you meant that, the decision to subsidize, you know, take the example of last year or this year or last year, the subsidies on petroleum, on gas, on petrol. It was not a decision of the IMF. It was a decision of the government of Pakistan to decide to subsidize. And each time, you know, I've been in in negotiating programs with, I don't know if Murtaza, you've been on the other side. I've been with the IMF and come in to discuss programs with the government of Pakistan. We had on one particular occasion, I wanted to prove to that this was a Pakistani program, was told the Pakistani government that, look, you decide what the program is going to look like. Here are the broad parameters that you must have. You go and write up a program that will fit these broad parameters. And I will promise you this, that I will take it to the IMF board exactly the way you have done. I will not even have it spell checked. And the reason I say it, not because of misspelling, because Pakistanis, by the way, use the English forms of writing, so, rather than the Americanized versions. So we basically, in my advice always to teams going out to Pakistan and to other countries when I was a director was, remember two things. Here are your broad parameters. These are what you negotiate within. And also remember that the people on the other side, sitting across the table from you, are just as well educated and just as smart as you are. And they have one big advantage. They're always the home team. You're the visitor. And so therefore, in the discussions that you have, the negotiations you have, I would just tell you, let them decide what they want to cut, where they want to spend, and then you just make sure that the overall target is respected. So I mean, the IMF becomes an easy whipping boy in this, and that's fine. I mean, the IMF is used to that. I don't think they get bothered by it at all, about being criticized. That I would just let Murtaza answer. I mean, because he is in the fortunate position. I have not been in this fortunate position of being on both sides of the fence, and he has. So, Murtaza.
Thank you. I think this is a great question. Look, 23 times to the IMF suggests that we have a bit of a moral hazard problem also going on, which is that we know that the IMF can bail us out time and time again. But it is very true, as Mohsin is saying, that the menu of choices are given by the IMF, and then we kind of have to decide what is politically feasible and what is doable in a period of time. The problem with the IMF programs is that they're short, and they try to make you do things very quickly. And typically then you go after the low-hanging fruit. And it's easier to tax people that are already in the tax net. It's difficult to bring people that are not in the tax net in, for example, just to give you one example. Most countries go to the IMF because they faced a temporary shock, the global conditions kind of worsened, or something went wrong with their growth model, and then they don't have to keep going. The fact that we have to keep going suggests there's something wrong with our growth model. And here I will say that India, we were talking about India before, they just went to the IMF once, right? And then they decided never again. And they're also a democracy. It's difficult to get things done. But Manmohan Singh, what he did in the 90s with the help of others, Monte Carlo, Aliya, Narasimha Rao providing a lot of political cover to the technocrats, was amazing. They had a minority government, and they were able to do things. They dismantled the regulations. They opened up to foreign investment. So that, I think, is something that we should look at. We're not an authoritarian environment. It's not easy for us to do what East Asia did. But we can certainly learn from what India did in the 90s and then kind of moved on. Just on inflation, if I can just take Faisal?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. So, Faisal, that's a good question. Look, when I say I'm cautiously optimistic, I meant that we are not sort of going to go belly under anytime soon from an external financing or debt kind of point of view. Inflation is a problem, I will give you that. People thought it was going to be transitory coming out of COVID. It turned out to be much more permanent. Many people got it wrong. The Fed got it wrong. ECB got it wrong. It started off as a supply side issue, kind of the dislocations with that. But in Pakistan's case, there was also a demand component because we were growing quite strongly after COVID. So what makes it tough is that the demand side you can deal with because you can slow the economy down, which is what we're doing. The supply side, you can usually look through. But because you've had such a massive supply shock, it's also affecting people's inflation expectations and wages. That's when you have a real problem. And that's why we're trying to tighten monetary policy. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, people don't think about the real rate. They look at the nominal rate, 16%, which is our policy rate. They think it's very high. But when you have inflation running at 25, 27%, the real rate is still negative. So you could argue that there's still some way to go in terms of monetary policy. But my point is that inflation is a worry. It's a worry globally. And I think the kind of effects that you're talking about, where people are substituting away from long-term kind of investments, is something we need to worry about. And the state bank now having a mandate to kind of target inflation because of the reforms to our act puts us in a position where we're able to do the things that we weren't able to do 3 or 4 years ago, where, as I said, we waited for a long time before we started tightening monetary policy.
Very quickly, Aliya, then Hafeez.
Ji, responding to Faisal's query, I just want to say that the literature also says that the fiscal consolidation that is tackled through taxes is much more effective than the one that is tackled through expenditure cuts. And the reason why I bring up expenditure cuts is that certain segments of our population that are becoming more vulnerable and marginalized may need social protection measures. And if we cannot protect our social protection expenditures, then there will be a problem. And very quickly also, Faisal, I think your query is also tied to household incomes falling and the number of dependents on a single earner or limited earners. So when I say that we have to intersect these issues with what is happening in the labor markets, I mean, I'm trying to make a point over there that we cannot just think that, the vulnerable segments will be protected even if their wages are not decently determined, they are not recognized as workers. I mean, we have to look at the whole baggage of issues related to this impact of the global transmission of inflation as well. Not all of it is Pakistan's problem at the moment.
Can I just make one very quick remark on the IMF issue, which Dr. Mohsin raised? You see, I've had to negotiate something like 3 IMF programs, if Moin might remember, one after him. You see, the sense one gets, with all due respects, is the quality of the IMF staff's knowledge of the country they are here to negotiate with. And quite frequently, they don't have that degree of insight into the process of negotiations that one might expect them to have. And that is why, and the other problem, of course, more recently has been that our own side doesn't have that necessary insight. So the end result is a combination which is difficult. But my own plea is a little bit of humility on the part of the IMF staff would be of great value to us in Pakistan. Very quickly, coming to the circular debt and the management of the power sector's capacity issue, the point is that, it's interesting, Pakistan till only recently had a shortage of capacity, and we went through a period of massive load shedding. Thereafter, particularly the CPEC investments, IPP, Chinese IPPs came and expanded capacity substantially, but there is not that much margin of excess capacity. The issue is not on the demand side. The issue frequently is the availability of fuel. And Pakistan is running short of LNG, running short of coal, and in fact, today the position is gas also is a problem, natural gas. So the end result is, yes, the capacity cost which we are committed to covering with a certain fixed return is thereby becoming artificially too high.
Thank you. Thank you, Hafeez. I'm going to take another round of questions. I'll start with you over there. Yes.
I'm Tasneem Zafar, working as Chief Instructor, Civil Services Academy. My question is that one of the policy advice that we receive from IMF is to move towards market-based exchange rates. And since we are not adhering to it, and that explains a lot of stuff with regard to our current account trade deficits, what are the major hindrances that we are facing at this when it comes to this aspect? Because right now there is a growing divergence between the open market and what in the black market. So and that is driving down the remittances. So I would like to hear your views with regard to it. Thank you.
So that's a terrific question, but let me take One more question. Please.
Waqas Paracha, Public Financial Management Advisor working in Oxford Policy Management. My question is, one of the potential benefits we are told that is to control and reduce inflation. But if you see the last 4 programs, the most of the recommendations are to apply indirect taxes like sales tax on services, which directly contribute to the inflation. So how this works? My second question is, the only one thing we have a surplus in Pakistan consistently growing is the population. So do you think that in a short term,
IMF program is the right instrument.
so
Stop having babies or no program.
so as a quick solution, if we export our HR as a short-term solution, will this work?
Okay, thank you. That gentleman over there. I'll take one more in this round. Iske baad.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saab. My name is Aliya Khan. I am working as Deputy Director with Civil Services Academy, Lahore. I'm also doing my PhD in Public Policy from the FC College. My question is from Dr. Aliya. I joined your talk towards the last leg. I don't know whether that was addressed in that or not. There is a new concept coming up that's called the triple helix effect, whereby the government, academia, and industry come together for targeted skills development. This phenomenon is not here in Pakistan. Does it exist in Bangladesh or India? That's my question. Thank you so much.
One more question.
Thank you, sir. My name is Wali Mohammed, and I'm Special Secretary to the Government of Balochistan. Though I have clear understanding of all the issues that have been discussed here in detail, and I agree with all the issues, there are really the issues in Pakistan. But one thing which I really often think about and want to clarify in my mind is, as to everybody talks in Pakistan of prescriptions, or descriptions rather, and more prescriptions and descriptions or combination of both. But what I don't understand is where the issue lies. Is it because of the lack of coordination among the various aspects or sectors of the private market, government policymakers, as well as the general public, or our economic managers are not in a position to address the issues? Where the issue lies, that is what I want to know. Generally speaking, all the issues we understand.
That's the hardest question to answer.
Yes.
But okay, let me take one more and then responses.
I am Ijaz, a mechanical engineer from Nurse University with Masters in Energy Engineering. My question is from Dr. Hafeez Pasha. This is about that 1,200 billion rupees power sector issue. We have installed 40,000 megawatt of power, and our peak demand in summers is 25,000 megawatt, and in winters it goes down even to 10,000 megawatt. So we have surplus electricity. So why can't we sell that surplus electricity, for which we are already paying capacity payments and 1,200 billion rupees? We can sell that electricity at low tariff. The other thing is that we can leapfrog our travel towards EV, electric vehicles, and the roadmap. We have EV policy in 2019. So as we can sell that surplus electricity to EV market and the transport sector, which is again a burden and emissions, and out of the 25 world most polluting cities, 25 are in Pakistan. We are sitting in Lahore, which is second today in the World Air Quality Index. So my question is, why can't we leapfrog towards EV? Okay. Thank you.
Very good. So we've got 5 questions here, and the exchange rate and inflation and indirect taxation. Murtaza.
Sure. So the exchange rate question is designed to kind of trip me up and get me into real trouble. But what I'll tell you is that we have moved to a flexible and market-determined exchange rate since the summer of 2019. And if you look at what's happened to the exchange rate since then, it's been going up and down, if you look at that broad period.
Let him finish.
Yes.
Bilateral करनी तो फिर बाद में कर.
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल. तो मैं एक तो ये बता दूं कि हमारा जो पॉलिसी है वो चेंज हो गई है, अब फ्लेक्सिबल और मार्केट डिटर्मिन्ड है, और एक्चुअली इस साल अगर आप देखें तो 20% हमारी डिप्रिसिएशन हुई है, वन ऑफ द लार्जेस्ट डिप्रिसिएशंस in the world. More recently, there has been some stability, and that is partly because, we are doing other things. कुछ हमने imports के ऊपर restrictions लगाई हुई हैं, as you know, about 10% of the imports are being restricted. So there are reasons why the exchange is stable. There is a spread between the interbank rate and the open market rate, and that's not a good thing. उसके भी वजूहात हैं. I mean, partly it's also because of Afghanistan and smuggling and things. But I wanted to just tell you that our policy has not changed. It's still flexible and market determined. We only come into the market and use our reserves when conditions are disorderly. And that remains our policy. ठीक है जी. On the indirect taxes, absolutely, it is inflationary. It is something that the IMF does worry about as well. But as Mohsin was saying, IMF का काम ये है कि वो आपको policy options दें, आप उनको बताएं कि भाई आप क्या कर सकते हैं. अब क्योंकि हमारा टाइम कम रह गया है इस प्रोग्राम में, तो IMF भी थोड़ी जल्दी में है. वो कहते हैं कि जी आपने टैक्स रेवेन्यू आपका गिर गया है इंस्टेड ऑफ गोइंग अप. उन्होंने भी तो अपने बोर्ड को बताना होता है कि कोई प्रोग्रेस हो रही है इस मुल्क में. तो फिर वो हमें आके कहते हैं कि जी क्या आप कर सकते हैं, फिर हम कहते हैं जी GST सबसे आसान है, फिर यही कर लेते हैं. तो ये आई थिंक इज अ थिंग. जस्ट ऑन द क्वेश्चन दैट द जेंटलमैन हैड अबाउट व्हाट्स गोइंग रॉन्ग, it's a combination of things, to be honest with you, but the chickens are coming home to roost, is what I will say. देखें 30 साल से हम लगे हुए हैं इस मॉडल में, हमने कोई इन्वेस्टमेंट नहीं की अपने लोगों में, पॉपुलेशन कंट्रोल नहीं किया, और हमारी कैपेसिटी जो है स्टेट के अंदर टू मेक गुड डिसीजंस हैज़ गॉन डाउन. हफीज़ पाशा साहब was saying कि ये ओवर टाइम हमारी भी नेगोशिएटिंग एबिलिटी हैज़ गॉन डाउन relatively, even though we're still the home team, we should have comparative advantage. लेकिन हमारी मिनिस्ट्रीज़ में unfortunately over time क्वालिटी थोड़ी सी गिर गई है. और सबसे इम्पॉर्टेंट चीज़ मेरा ख्याल है जो नहीं है, it's I think political courage, because these things are difficult to do. They will involve pain, and you have to be straight with your population कि they will involve pain. अगर आपने reform करना है अपने model of your growth, it's going to take some time, it takes some pain, but you get to a better place. तो ये मेरे ख्याल में कुछ चीज़ें हैं that are contributing to this bad equilibrium that we're in right now.
If I can just follow up briefly on the lady's question over here. Because I'm not in the State Bank of Pakistan, I can be a little more candid, shall I say, than Murtaza will be. See, there's in international economics literature, there's a very important concept, and it's called the trilemma or the impossibility theorem. And the impossibility theorem says the following: that you can have a capital account mobility, independent monetary policy, and a flexible exchange rate. Okay, and those are the conditions. Okay, for inflation targeting, which the central bank does. Breaking down, and if you lose one of these things, you have to give up something. If you want to have an independent monetary policy, or you want to have a different exchange rate policy from a freely floating rate, or you have to give up something. What in Pakistan they've given up, and I'll disagree somewhat with my colleague here on the exchange rate, what they've given up here is the absence of controls. Now, okay, you impose, doesn't sound very much that we've only imposed controls, administrative controls or import controls on 10%. I think that is officially true. But if you've got restrictions on opening of LCs, and you've got restrictions such that people, importers of raw materials and machinery are stuck, have equipment stuck in ports because they can't offload them, immediately through the economy, even that small percentage spreads through, and people just do not believe that the exchange rate is truly floating. And in my estimation, it's not truly floating right now. The intervention is coming through these kind of controls. Yes, Afghanistan smuggling is an issue. Why should it be an issue? The rate should float. If the demand is there in Afghanistan at 260, then the rate should be 260. Why is it not 260? The reason is that somebody in government, I will not say who, because I don't know who, somebody in government would not like the rate to go beyond a certain level. And that's, unfortunately, as an outsider, my critique of the State Bank of Pakistan is that it has caved into this issue of the exchange rate. And I'm sorry, just give you a small example which I've given a colleague of mine the other day. When I go to change money in Pakistan, in the Foreign Exchange Bureau in the main boulevard of Gulberg, I went to the counter, and the guy at the counter, the man at the counter says to me, "Ki kitne chahte hain aap?" So I said, kya matlab kitne chahte hain? I mean, main dollar bech raha hu. So the man standing on the next line in the counter, on the other counter, announced to the entire bank कि ये साहब बेच रहे हैं डॉलर, इनके लिए स्पेशल काउंटर होना चाहिए क्योंकि बाकी सारी दुनिया खरीद रही है, ये बेच रहे हैं. And वहाँ in the foreign exchange center, they had an implicit restriction कि $200 के ज़्यादा नहीं आपको बेच सकते. Now that is a restriction. That's a clear and obvious foreign exchange restriction, and there may be good reason for that. Whatever the reason is, the rate is not freely floating.
Aliya, please. Tripartite skills programs. Because he's been sending daggers at me because I'm too late. So please.
Triple helix की आपने बात की, yes, it is very weak in Pakistan. It's not totally absent. और उसमें मैं primarily academia के ऊपर finger pointing करूँगी because I think it is easier for academia. I mean, I carved out a niche for myself in working with the government and, making inroads. At the cost of obviously something, but the returns are there. Hamari universities, especially the large public sector universities, are very, very closed. They operate in very closed environments. So I think we have to break out because I think academia can become wonderful intermediaries in terms of taking the policy analysis to the government tables, and I can say something that they are receptive. ये जो एक myth है कि वो bureaucracy सुनना ही नहीं चाहती और उनके पास time नहीं है. ठीक है, time नहीं है, आप उसको concise करके और main focus points के सूरत में बताएं, लेकिन किसी तरह ये knowledge universities के citadels से निकल के transmit होनी चाहिए. और private sector के साथ भी यही है. एक दफ़ा HEC ने एक program शुरू किया था industry academia लिंकेज का, तो वाइस चांसलर ने कहा कि आलिया आप इसको लीड करें. तो जिस दिन हम मीटिंग के लिए जा रहे थे इस्लामाबाद चेंबर ऑफ कॉमर्स, तो सारे प्रोफेसर्स जो थे, आई थिंक एन एसोसिएट प्रोफेसर एट दैट टाइम, वो मेरे से नाराज़ हो रहे थे कि ये देखें, ये अब दुकानदारों से मिलवाने हमें ले जा रही हैं. सो दिस इज़ it's a shameful way to label the private sector, but that is the kind of breakthroughs that Pakistan needs, and yes, it is much stronger in India and Bangladesh if you were asking about it.
Thank you, Aliya. मैं एक suggestion दूंगा, अगर आप तो higher level skills की बात होगी, अगर आप vocational skills की बात करते हैं, तो उसके लिए there is a model of public-private working together to provide skills. I suggest you take a look at Punjab Skills Development website और देखें वो model कैसा काम कर रहा है. हफीज़, प्लीज़.
मैं इजाज़त दें तो हल्के से एक बात करना चाहता हूँ ऑन दिस एक्सचेंज रेट पॉलिसी इशू, और वो ये है कि पिछले रिव्यू के प्रोसेस में, नॉट द 9th but the 7th and 8th earlier on, we got the central bank, the State Bank of Pakistan, a very major fundamental amendments which presumably the assumption was would lead to a truly autonomous central bank. But that has not happened. And that is where we have gone wrong. The State Bank has failed to assert its autonomy. So this is where I feel very sad that we are hostage to the views of one individual. आखिरी बात on this issue of exporting electricity. काश ऐसा होता. बात यह है कि आपकी इलेक्ट्रिसिटी प्राइसिंग और कॉस्ट जो है वो इतनी ऊंची है कि आप नहीं एक्सपोर्ट कर सकते. और आपको हैरत होगी कि छोटा मोटा इंपोर्ट करते हैं हम ईरान से इलेक्ट्रिसिटी अभी भी. The question of exporting electricity, unfortunately, does not arise. But on the other hand, your idea of new technologies, solar, electricity use, is completely well taken, and government should move ahead with these programs.
Thank you. Look, this has been a terrific panel. टॉपिक ऐसा था कि इस पे हम बहुत देर बात, सारा दिन इसी पे बात कर सकते हैं, क्योंकि स्टेबलाइजेशन पे फिर फिस्कल आ जाता है, फिर ट्रेड आ जाता है, तो उसके अपने फिर रियल सेक्टर इश्यूज खड़े हो जाते हैं. द बिग टेक अवे फॉर मी इज़ कि look, we know how to manage our macroeconomic crises. We've been there before. The reason why we keep going back to that, those lows in macroeconomic stability is because we are not doing what Hafeez said. We are not fixing the fiscal deficit, and we are not fixing what Aliya said, becoming competitive to export to the world. These are the issues on which we need to focus on, and not कि जी हमारा कब हो रहा है, exchange rate is going to 300 or that we are about to default, etc. None of that is going to, default is not on the cards for Pakistan. That's not the kind of external debt we have. It's by and large concessionary debt, और ये roll over हो जाता है. अगर debt का हमारा कोई problem है तो वो domestic debt है. It's a very large debt which we owe to our banks. और banks की मशकें कसनी इनको आती हैं. तो वो, so I think we should feel rest assured about default, but would really worry about what Dr. Aliya said and what Dr. Hafeez Pasha said. Thank you very much. Well done.